My name is Stephen Arno. I'm a retired research forester, and I first saw whitebark pine while hiking in the northeastern Olympic Mountains in 1960. Uh, then throughout the early 60s, I saw it in many places in the northeastern Olympic Mountains. It's kind of an outlier there. By 1965, I had seen it in many more places, including the Washington Cascades, Oregon's Wallowa Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the Northern Rockies. Except in California and Oregon, it was already besieged by the introduced disease white pine blister rust, and to some extent by mountain pine beetles. In 1970, while working as a forester on northern Idaho's Kenexu National Forest, forest ecologist Earl Laser and I commiserated about whitebark pine's fate. Then, while working on Bob Pfister's habitat type project, and later at the Missoula Fire Sciences Laboratory, I realized that whitebark is a fire-dependent species, unable to compete with other conifers without periodic fires. At this time, other forest ecologists had reached similar conclusions, but whitebark cone crops were being recognized as a critical food source for the Clark's nutcracker, squirrels, and both black and grizzly bears. By the 1990s, biologists Diana Tombach, Kate Kendall, and ecologists Tad Weaver, Ward McCoy, and Ron Lanner, and the young fire ecologist Bob Keane saw the need to form a Whitebark Pine Ecological Foundation, or WPEF, to promote research and on-the-ground activities such as planting rust-resistant seedlings being grown at the Coeur d'Alene Nursery, Forest Service Nursery by Mary Frances Maholovich. Under the leadership of Tombach and Keane and Whitebark Pine Foundation of Canada, the organization has piled up many accomplishments in recent years. That's all.
So, Steve, also, when you did your PhD dissertation in Alpine Larch, did you study whitebark pine at the same time, or did you notice anything about whitebark and Alpine Larch communities?
Yeah, they are complementary. The whitebark is generally found on the drier sites, and the larch is found on the more moist sites.
So during the your dissertation, did you find that the whitebark were declining even then while you were studying at Alpine Larch?
Oh, absolutely.
And did that lead to the paper that you wrote in 1986, the in Western Journal of Applied Forestry, about the decline of whitebark pine?
Yes, certainly did.
Huh. Well, maybe you can tell us a little more about some whitebark pine ecology that you happen to notice in your years of doing research.
Well, for one thing, it's very it tends to be other than the alpine larch, it tends to grow up higher than other species in the mountains. I noticed, particularly in the Sierra Nevada, that it was it and foxtail pine were the trees that ascended to the highest elevations, although whitebark would be in a Krummholz form where foxtail pine would be erect.
So I noticed that there have been several papers recently that have shown in the Sierras, the Cascades, and even the Rocky Mountains that these droughts we're having in the subalpine and upper subalpine are killing the subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. But whitebark pine seems to be doing really well, even in these drought situations. And then I remembered that you thought that whitebark was very drought tolerant. Is that still true, you think?
Yes, for sure. Another thing about whitebark that I think is not readily recognized is that it can survive through at least many of the whitebarks, not all of them, can survive for 100 or even 150 years and produce cones before they are fatally attacked by the rust and bark beetles. Now, it doesn't mean that they won't have rust, but they still can produce cone crops.
Yeah. So another thing that we're finding out that I think that you also told me is that whitebark pine isn't really that tolerant of fire. It seems to be killed quite easily by fire, a lot easier than we thought. Do you think that's true, or do you think there are populations where whitebark pine does have some survival characteristics for fire?
No, I think you're right. The only thing is that often the fuel, if the fuel fuel bed is extremely light, for instance, just mountain heath and smooth wood rush, then there's really nothing much to burn. Or if it's growing in the rock, in the talus.
Yeah. Well, apparently a lot of people have been looking at what the aftermath of wildfires and seeing a lot of whitebark pine mortality after fire, and mainly from bark cambial kill. And so do you have any insight into that? Do you think that that's probably true, or is that just an odd population?
Would you restate that, please?
So it seems like a lot of whitebark pine are dying when we put fire into these stands. So I wonder if, during our Smith Creek study, when you and I put in the fire in Smith Creek in 1996, we saw a lot of whitebark mortality. So any insight you have into why whitebark is definitely a fire dependent species, but it doesn't seem to be able to survive it quite well?
Yeah, it's under stress. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Huh.
So that's probably a large part of the reason. And Smith Creek had a lot of fuel, really. It was completely different than a really high elevation whitebark that only had the mountain heath.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Steve.